Hello, I'm Charles Dooley, and I'll be talking about ideas presented in both I Am Not Your Negro by James Baldwin and Latin History for Morons, which was presented and performed by John Leguizamo, and I'll also be talking about the vision of history seen in the two pieces of art. So, I Am Not Your Negro was narrated by James Baldwin, who was an American writer who wrote mostly about race and politics, and he was also on the scene during the civil rights movements during the late 1950s and all throughout the 1960s. And so this film sort of highlights the story of America through the lives of Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X, who all three of them were murdered for their heavy roles in the civil rights movements. So, one event that the film highlights early on in the story is the story of Dorothy Counts, who was a 15-year-old girl from Charlotte, North Carolina, who had to be escorted through mobs of white children and adults screaming slurs at her, and all she was trying to do was just get to school and try and learn and have a normal school day. And there's a picture that I'll put up right now, and one thing that Baldwin notes about this overall situation and the photo being shown is Dorothy's, and direct quote from the movie, unutterable pride, tension, and anguish in her face as she approached the halls of learning with history jeering at her back. And so one thing that sort of stuck out to me from this quote from Baldwin was that it can sort of be applied throughout all of American history, especially recent history with African Americans and the civil rights movement and how it's progressed throughout the last 100 years, we'll say. And that idea is the great pride that many African Americans have in being who they are, and even if it means, and having this pride can sometimes lead to them having to sacrifice their own life, and that's ultimately what happened with thousands of people, most notably, and who are talked about in the film, MLK, Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers. And so I think this idea of having pride in who you are is one that is evident throughout the entire film, and it is shown through a ton of different clips of African Americans protesting segregation and simultaneously demanding equal rights during this time, and all the way through the decade up until today. So another event that the film highlights are the series of events that were happening in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. And so during this time, Birmingham was sort of like a hotspot for police brutality against innocent African Americans, and many times this brutality led to the death of innocent African American people. And alongside this police brutality, there were a few bombings that targeted and killed African Americans. And so the way Baldwin addresses this topic is very interesting, as he says, direct quote, "White people don't want to believe in Birmingham, and they don't want to acknowledge that this is happening nationwide." And so by saying this, Baldwin brings attention to the fact that this violence against African Americans was happening all around the country, and it was happening all the time. So to sort of tie this event, or a series of events from the film I Am Not Your Negro, into the second film we watched, Latin History for Morons, John Leguizamo says in Latin History for Morons that violence is the lowest form of communication. And so I think that this idea of violence being the lowest form of communication, if it is any at all, I think that idea can sort of be applied practically during the entirety of the film I Am Not Your Negro, as it highlights the unjust violence against African Americans. And so going back to the events in Birmingham in 1963, the idea of how whites refused to acknowledge this was happening is kind of shown a few different times during the film. And so a little later on in the film, Baldwin declared that, quote, direct quote, It was not a racial problem. It's whether or not you're willing to look at your life and be responsible for it, and then change it. And so, obviously, during that time, white people were not checking themselves, nor were they even willing to do so. And so, to quickly change gears between films, shifting my focus to Latin history for morons, Leguizamo sort of comically implies that his Latino history has been kept from him and hidden from him for a while. And he says that the contributions of Latinos and Latinas to the Northern American culture are often overlooked and not even really mentioned to begin with. And so he kind of gives a lesson about Latin history throughout the course of his little play or act, and he speaks about how much Latins have been through, and this involves the Indian extermination, anti-immigration policies, the Trail of Tears, but he specifically harps on the fact that we, as in Latins, are still here and will continue to fight through these challenges. And so towards the end of his act, he gives some serious facts about Latinos, explaining that they are victim to 60% of hate crimes, and they are the most jailed minority. And on the bright side, they had 30,000 troops fight for America in World War I, and 500,000 fight for America in World War II. And he also states that they are the only ethnic group to fight in every single war for America, including the American Revolution and the Civil War. So, in the end, I think that both films do a great job presenting on the history of their respected groups, and both films sort of teach lessons through the events of history of how to and how to not treat humans. And I think it's a good thing that we can learn from. And finally, I think how the story of the black man and the story of the Latino is the story of America. And sometimes it isn't quite a pretty story, but it is one that we have to talk about, and it is one that we sort of have to embrace sometimes, but it's more importantly something that we have to learn from.